From the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, this is Trending Globally. I'm Dan Richards. One day, as an undergraduate at West Point, Tyler Jost attended a breakfast that really stuck with him.
With the head of the Chinese Navy.
This was not, of course, a casual meeting in the dining hall.
But I sat at the table where the superintendent of West Point, the U.S. Military Academy, was having his meal.
Tyler observed the meeting and the exchange between these two figures, and he found himself wondering,
when the head of the Chinese Navy went back and briefed Hu Jintao, as it was at the time, what was that meeting like? What did that look like?
In other words, at the highest levels of government, how exactly is information passed from a military advisor to a country's leader? It was a question Tyler kept asking as he entered graduate school for political science.
And I just sort of became fascinated by these types of interactions between leaders and military advisors. That's what drove me.
In many ways, it's continued to drive him. Tyler today is a political scientist and assistant professor at the Watson Institute and an expert on international security and the Chinese military. And his new book, Bureaucracies at War, The Institutional Origins of Miscalculation, explores how leaders in China and beyond process information behind closed doors. Are there open channels of communication between a country's leaders and security advisors? Are there forums for debate and disagreement? Is the leader presented with facts that challenge them? And what can we do to design systems that help leaders to make better decisions? In one sense, the questions this book explores are timeless. But Tyler's book also feels especially timely as tensions continue to rise between the US and China, and the world adjusts once again to an American president unmoored by traditional norms and institutions. The stakes of a military conflict have never been higher, and the need for clear, accurate analysis of the costs and benefits of military actions is more important than ever. And Tyler's book gets us closer to understanding how to avoid mistakes when it comes to military actions that the world may no longer be able to afford to make. Before getting into the book, I started by asking Tyler about the tensions we are already seeing between the US and China in the early days of the Trump administration. We recorded this conversation in early February, right as Trump announced his plan to impose a 10% tariff on Chinese goods. In response, China imposed retaliatory tariffs on a more limited range of American goods. So I wanted to understand from Tyler, how should we be interpreting this tit-for-tat escalation of tariffs between these two countries? And what can it tell us about the US-China relationship more broadly in this new Trump term? While some of the details may be a little bit different by the time you hear this podcast, Tyler's overall analysis is as relevant as ever. Here's Tyler.
As a starting point, it's difficult to know exactly what's being said inside the Oval Office, of course. But my read on the situation is essentially that this is a continuation of policy shifts in the United States that began in the first Trump administration. Relations between the two countries became quite heated, of course, in the second half of the first Trump term. But there was a broader reorientation in the way that the two countries dealt with one another that, surprisingly in some ways, was not unique to Trump. Trump certainly put things in place that made the reorientation much more publicly salient. And by the last 18 months of the administration, things were quite heated. But the fundamental tenets of that reorientation actually persisted through the Biden administration.
And so what do you see as the key components then of this reorientation towards China that you describe sort of existed in the first Trump administration and continued in the Biden administration, and that you see as, continuing on now?
Well, the fundamental aspect of it is a shift towards a more competitive tenor to the relationship. And certainly the two countries had areas that they were interested in competing in into the first and second term of the Obama administration. But what became apparent by the late 2010s is that the United States wanted to much more forcefully essentially put its foot on the gas in a lot of these areas and be willing to publicly acknowledge that it was doing so. Broadly speaking, you could divide it into two categories. There's a material component and an ideological component. On the material side, I think the United States is concerned about China's growing material power, both economic and military. But it certainly doesn't explain the whole story. So a portion of this pertains to the way in which China has exercised its power and the changes in the ways that it exercised power in the 2010s.
Well, speaking of how China changed the way it sort of exercises its power in the 2010s, you recently wrote an article about some of these sort of more combative diplomacy styles that Chinese officials adopted in the late 2010s.
Wolf warriorism.
Wolf warriorism, yes, that it, included these really kind of intense public statements that, compared other countries to lightweight boxers in a match with China, or saying things to, critics of certain Chinese policies like, don't play with fire, you might burn yourself.
For our enemies, we have shotguns. I'm not sure if that's a precise quote, but it's something.
Yeah, right. And, could you just describe a little bit for listeners, like, why did this start to happen in this way all of a sudden in the late 2010s? And how can it help us think about China's foreign policy approach now?
As a term of art, this is a thing that came about in the early 2020s to describe an evocative, provocative, and almost rude diplomatic rhetoric that was being used by Chinese diplomats in order to fend off attacks, often about the legitimacy of the regime's actions. The reason I call it rude is not because I was personally offended. It's just because of the reference point. When we think about diplomats, the diplomats are the people, that are supposed to be talking about how can our countries cooperate. They're supposed to be talking about how can we talk our differences out. And generally speaking, there's this kind of art within diplomacy of finding the most tactful way to say a very unpleasant thing. And what was so unusual about it was you have diplomats associated with the foreign ministry speaking in ways that we wouldn't necessarily expect diplomats to speak. What that piece that you're talking about that came out in Foreign Affairs was really about was this marked increase in the late 2010s, just before, but then really accelerating during the COVID-19 pandemic, in this type of behavior. And then a kind of folk perception that this had leveled off and maybe even was on the decline, let's say. So when I started writing the piece, I sort of wanted to look at, is this right? Is this characterization that we sometimes hear floating around, is it right? And that pattern did indeed seem to hold, right? We could find traces of it during the early Xi era, but a real big uptick right around 2019, and then a leveling off and even a downward slope beginning in a couple of years later. So once we sort of got the story right, then the question became why? And the story that I came away with is China, for a variety of reasons, found itself to be in the spotlight of international criticism at a particular moment in time. Why was this the case? Well, it was partly things that were going on at home. You had repression in Xinjiang. You had the crackdown in Hong Kong. It was only natural for many countries to criticize it, particularly if you come from a liberal democratic tradition. And so this surge was a kind of fighting back. A second component of it, and the reason why this accelerated so much in 2020, was not just the fact that U.S.-China relations bilaterally were souring, but if you think about it, the pandemic itself put the spotlight on the regime's legitimacy, in part because of some of the ways that the CCP early on in the pandemic framed this as a kind of referendum on institutional performance. If you think back to the early months of the pandemic, some observers were looking at China and saying, oh, this looks pretty good in comparison to some of the instability in Western democracies.
The extent to which they were initiating lockdowns and maintaining the spread of
right.
COVID.
So Beijing eventually becomes tied to that narrative. And as it becomes less clear that this is a good solution long term, coupled with the questions of the origins of the virus and the potential institutional pathologies associated with the virus's origins, then you have another set of criticisms internationally that Beijing feels compelled to respond to. And if you look closely at statements that are publicly available from Chinese diplomats about wolf warriorism, it is almost always in the context of feeling that the country is under attack and needing to respond to it. So that is the argument.
And so why did this type of, quote unquote, wolf warriorism, just rude approach to certain, diplomatic communications, why did it recede in the last few years?
If one thinks about the leveling off during the Biden administration, one hypothesis that would be congruent with this general argument is that, well, the Biden administration, for some of the talk that it had about competition between democracy and autocracy, did make some reassurances to Beijing that it was not interested in regime change, that it was not interested in a new Cold War that would pit the two sides sort of against one another, so on and so forth. And that could be seen as one explanation for why you get a dipping. The other really important alternative explanation here, it could be the case that a flagging Chinese economy that leaders are realizing by late 2022 and 2023, that could be one reason why Chinese leaders decide that they really need a more stable relationship with the United States. And if they see this as one of the things that's pushing bilateral relations in a negative direction, maybe you ease off this in order to promote some stability while the economy is down.
Were these types of communications, which were, on Twitter, but also there were more public just remarks, was it a top-down directive, you think, to start using this type of language, or was it sort of just more of a cultural shift, almost a trend in how these people were approaching foreign policy?
We don't really know. We do know that Xi Jinping consistently talks about telling China's story well, and a mandate that the foreign ministry and diplomats in China do just that. Now, there's lots of ways to purportedly tell China's story well. One can do this by sort of standing up and being bold, or it can be done through subtler means. So that's what we know publicly for sure. There are some rumors, and they're really just rumors, that in late 2019, there was some communication from the very top that encouraged the foreign ministry to be a little more assertive in its public rhetoric. And it's possible that it coincides with some of the increase that we saw the following year.
And in the piece you wrote about this, I believe the subtitle of the article was why this wolf warriorism went extinct and why we might see it again. So why do you think we might see something like that again?
If the argument's right, it would imply that one of two things could lead to it re-emerging. The first would be if there are either domestic events inside of China which force repression, which will then in turn prompt Western countries to criticize, which will then force the debate that we saw akin to 2019, 2020. Of course, that kind of international debate or international contestation could emerge for other reasons that don't have to do with domestic repression. But that would be one condition. And the other condition would be if that alternative hypothesis is true, and this really is just about a flagging Chinese economy. If China turns it around, perhaps they ratchet the wolf warriorism back up. That could be the case. As is often the case in world politics, the world is complex.
Well, and sort of leaning into some of the complexity of thinking about world events, I want to turn now a little bit to your recent book, Bureaucracies at War, the Institutional Origins of Miscalculation. It looks at the reasons why leaders make miscalculations when it comes to entering or initiating conflicts. And I think especially at this moment, as we have a new president who is notoriously unpredictable and growing tensions between the United States and many countries around the world, including, as we've discussed, China, we are all eager to understand why and how there are miscalculations and how they can be avoided. And you focus specifically on the decision-making of a country's leaders, because especially in the world of national security and military, it's a space where leaders have a sort of unique amount often of kind of executive authority. So their decision-making is incredibly consequential. And, you focus on how leaders listen to or fail to listen to the, institutions that surround them, intelligence agencies, military agencies, those sorts of things, and how those relationships inform what leaders decide. So I guess to start, just what got you interested in looking at how institutions shape how leaders enter or don't enter or navigate military conflicts?
I started graduate school in 2014. And around that time, the field had, for a variety of reasons, become quite interested in the role of individual heads of state, presidents, prime ministers, and dictators. And in the realm of international security, the road to war in particular, these individuals play a big role, right? They have a lot of authority to decide yay or nay. And essentially what that part of the discipline was really interested in is the prior experiences that leaders bring with them to office. And so that varies everything from like what happened to your childhood to did you serve in the military to what's the kind of dispositional worldview that you have about the world. Do you lean more hawkish or do you lean more dovish? But there was this natural question, and I often use that picture of JFK kind of looking out the window in the Oval Office alone, right? Standing alone. I don't know if you've ever seen that photo. I believe the title of that photo is something like the loneliest job in the world, right? And I use this image as sort of like where I felt the discipline was at the time. We were sort of like thinking about state action on the road to war as resting entirely on the shoulders of one single individual, as if they were almost making this decision in a vacuum. And of course, that wasn't right. What fascinated me was what happens inside of the state and how does that potentially shape the choices that leaders make. On a more personal level, I came to graduate school just very interested in the Chinese military. I had gone to West Point for my undergrad, and I had, as a cadet, gotten to have breakfast with the head of the Chinese Navy. Not me personally, but I sat at the table where the superintendent of West Point, the U.S. Military Academy, was having his meal. And so I was kind of vaguely interested from that point of view. And then I think what happened alongside that was I read Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August about the origins of World War I and the German military's role in the origins of World War I. And I just sort of became fascinated by these types of interactions between leaders and military advisors. That type of a story, that type of interaction, that type of event, I wanted to know, what did that look like in China? Like when the head of the Chinese Navy went back and briefed Hu Jintao, as it was at the time. What was that meeting like? That's what drove me.
Your book looks at these different ways that the institutions that surround leaders can be sort of organized and how that affects the decisions that the leader ultimately makes. What are the most important qualities that institutions sort of need to have to be effective at advising leaders?
Yeah, bureaucrats do lots of different things. The book starts with this very stylized premise where a leader is sort of, it's almost like the JFK picture, right? So the leader is looking out at the world and trying to decide, is it a good idea to initiate an international confrontation with another country or not? And the proposition in that introductory frame, let's call it, generally speaking, confrontations, war, crises can advance the state's interests, but there's also risks associated with this. Oftentimes, military conflict is quite costly, right? And it can be the case that conflicts don't just fail to achieve your objectives, but you can actually lose ground in the process. And so as a general proposition, you want to avoid conflicts that don't advance your interests, and you might want to select into conflicts that do. You can think about it as a type of prediction problem. Okay, how much would I gain and at what probability? And so if I wanted to do that, what do I need? Well, I could just sort of flip a coin. That's one method of making the decision. I could rely strictly on my own judgment, what I know about the situation, or I could mobilize the state in order to help me think it through that problem more fully, right? It might be the case, actually, that the leader sitting alone in the Oval Office or in Zhongnanhai, wherever it is, does best by not consulting anybody. In contrast, you might think, no, actually, there might be some real good reasons why you would want to engage the state. And this is where the book lands.
It might seem intuitive to listeners that a country's leader will benefit from hearing from experts, but it's not really that simple, as you kind of explain in the book. And so I wonder if you could spell out, what exactly are the arguments you make about how and why the design of these institutions and how they communicate with a leader affect a leader's decision-making?
Essentially, there's two arguments about why that's a good idea. The first is that human beings have a finite amount of time, resources, and mental capacity, right? They can only do so much. They can only collect so much information. And so engaging the state expands the scope of information to which the leader has access as they're trying to make this important decision. Now, of course, that doesn't mean anything if the information that's being supplied to the leader is highly biased, if it's wrong, if it's an inaccurate depiction of the world. So the question becomes, how do you design the state in a way that incentivizes bureaucrats to provide truthful information?
The first step, according to Tyler?
It requires overcoming fear of speaking truth to power. It's tricky to get a bureaucrat to say, no, boss, I think something else.
But it's not as simple as making sure good, accurate information is able to move up the chain, which brings us to the second feature.
You want to try to force bureaucracies that sort of have naturally different perspectives to be in dialogue with one another, to deliberate with one another, to debate with one another in front of the leader so that they can see both sides of the story. And you sort of force them to compete to make the best argument.
One example of where this type of communication is especially important is between a state's diplomats and diplomatic institutions and their military and intelligence institutions.
Putting those two in dialogue with one another through institutional rules that sort of perhaps point them to the same decision-making body or the same coordination body. That's the way in which you kind of, the book argues, solve that second bit, to get not just more information to the leader, but higher quality information to the leader. So essentially, you can think about the institutions that leaders set up to either keep themselves isolated or to try to harness the state and make the bureaucracy compete against itself in order to supply good information.
In the book, Tyler describes these two designs of institutions as either fragmented or integrated.
In the context of the relationship between state and society, we have a really nice lexicon, a really nice vocabulary to talk about differences. We have democracies and we have autocracies. Sometimes we call those dictatorships. But generally speaking, we have a vocabulary to talk about the ways in which states differ along this state-society dimension. One of the starting points for the book is that we really don't have that vocabulary to discuss the ways in which states differ in the way that they structure these bureaucratic institutions, these institutions of the inner workings of the state. And so it offers that. The vocabulary itself is not necessarily the most important, but it does give us a language to think about these two dimensions in a systematic way.
While thinking about this sort of framework and this language you provide to help us think about it, I want to take it back to the world we live in right now. And I think our current president, Trump, is sort of known for being kind of unpredictable in his decision making and sometimes really making decisions to the consternation of these institutions that have traditionally had more sway on presidents. And I wonder, how do you think about the way that different, intelligence and military institutions are operating in the Trump administration? Are they serving Trump to make accurate decisions? Is he contributing to them being more integrated or more fragmented, or how do you think about it?
It would be a bit of a caricature to say that, at least what we know publicly, the Trump administration has formally changed institutions like the National Security Council. During the first administration, there are some reports that some of the subsidiary bodies inside the National Security Council were tweaked in a way that might have made it a little bit harder to coordinate. There are some reports that it was sort of tough to get information to Trump, particularly on particular issues. But It's really interesting. I find it quite difficult to comment conclusively on contemporary decision-making processes because we often in our contemporary accounts get them so wrong because we have so little insight into what's actually going on. But there are things that have leaked out. Certainly, if Trump were to take to the logical conclusion his interest in massively curtailing bureaucratic capacity in the United States, if bureaucrats, as the result of these things, no longer feel that they can speak truth to power and feel like they have to manipulate the reporting or withhold the reporting in order to survive, that can, at lower levels, initiate some of the pathologies that the book talks about. And if Trump were to sort of disband everything, even the upper level advisory bodies surrounding him, like the National Security Council, then you really are in the realm that the book is talking about. It's this very pathological system in which it's really difficult for the leader to get any kind of good information from the state.
You know, as we wrap up, how can this thinking about the design of, the institutions and the bureaucracies that inform leaders on the road to military actions, what role do you see those designs playing in U.S.-China relationship going forward? And, what are you keeping an eye out for, where you see risks in how this all could lead to dangerous escalation, and where do you see maybe opportunities that the design of these institutions could maybe help U.S.-China relations? And, I'm curious about how you see it for Washington, but also especially as a China expert, how you see it in Beijing and among Xi Jinping and his inner circle. How are you kind of applying this sort of thinking into analysis of just this relationship more generally right now?
Yeah, it's interesting. As we said before, right, world politics is complicated, and it's often the case that one variable that explains one thing pretty well doesn't necessarily explain other things. And so I'm working on a second book, which is about a number of different things. But one of the points of departure is what happened to U.S.-China relations over the last 2 decades. And bureaucracy, at least in the book's current form, is not central to the explanation. It has to do with other things. That being said, it still could affect things at the margins. How might it do so? Well, essentially 2 ways. The first we alluded to with the Trump administration. So if really severe attacks on the bureaucracy did push forward, then you could potentially set conditions for failure, set conditions for miscalculation. The one which I've written about is on the Chinese side. So here the question is whether or not Xi Jinping's consolidation of power and his removal of senior officials situated or previously embedded in the national security bureaucracy, whether or not that sets conditions for the type of chilled bureaucratic establishment that the book discusses. The situation in which bureaucrats are really afraid to speak truth to power. And it is the case that people who have engaged with lower rungs of the Chinese foreign policy bureaucracy have come away with the impression that there is a real fear in the settings that they have participated of saying certain things, particularly once Xi Jinping makes a decision about something, it becomes quite difficult to say, well, that's not the case anymore. That's not working. This policy is ineffective. What we don't know is whether or not that chilling effect has traveled all the way up to the advisors that have the most access to Xi Jinping. So there's some reports that Xi makes decisions in a very insular fashion. If that's true, then of course that would have potentially a chilling effect. If it is the case that there's even the perception that these removals from key positions are not just linked to poor performance and not just linked to allegations of either political indiscretion or corruption, but rather you spoke your mind and I'm going to remove you. If there's any of that behind closed doors, that's of course something to be very worried about. And the real point of concern here, a scenario in which there's a war over Taiwan, for example, I think most likely happens not because China feels that it's at the peak of its power and it's not going to get any better in the future, but rather that Xi Jinping feels reasonably confident that it's going to go one way and it ends up going another way. Thinking about that interaction between the leader and the senior military leadership, when Xi Jinping looks at them and says, what do you think is going to happen? What's your prediction? What do you think the likelihood is that we can achieve our objective here? I think that is the moment that things break one way or the other. And from that perspective, all of these institutional features that could potentially push that interaction in a way where the bureaucrat feels, I have no choice but to say green light, that is a dangerous pathway and one that we should be seriously watching out for.
Tyler Jost, thank you so much for coming on to Trending Globally.
Thanks for having me.
This episode was produced by me, Dan Richards, and Zach Hirsch. Additional production assistance by Eric Emma. Our theme music is by Henry Bloomfield, with additional music by the Blue Dot Sessions. If you like this show, leave us a rating or review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps others to find us. And if you haven't subscribed to Trending Globally, please do that too. If you have any questions or comments or ideas for guests or episode topics, send us an email at trendingglobally@brown.edu. Again, that's all one word, trendingglobally@brown.edu. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Trending Globally. Thanks for listening.